everyone, welcome back to Redefine the Circle. I'm Ashley Sunshine, co-owner and head of pitching development here at OGX. Today's episode, we have Laura McDonald. Laura, welcome back to Redefine the Circle.
Always a pleasure to be here.
Okay, let's get right into it. Today's discussion is about biomechanics. So,
It's my favorite topic.
for those of you who don't know why Laura is sitting next to me if we're talking about biomechanics, go back and do your homework maybe.
Maybe.
You're the person that obviously our lead biomechanist, the person who has really helped us from the start ever since we really started diving into the world of pitching biomechanics. Maybe give a quick little 30-second why you're our person for biomechanics. Just not tell us your whole history, but what, from your PhD program, what sort of led you down this path, and why when we met you, at this point, what feels like 100 years ago,
It does.
in a good way,
Mm-hmm.
but why we were obviously, a match made to be.
So I think most people that get into work like this, you've had your own experience in the game that was, maybe positive or negative. Mine was a little negative from an injury standpoint. And when I went to graduate school, I have an undergraduate degree in athletic training. I was like, I just want to tape ankles the rest of my life. And I had three choices for my graduate degree in exercise science, concentration. It was motor control, ex-phys, and biomechanics. And I'm like, well, one of those sounds interesting to me. And then I fell in love with biomechanics. It was a way to actually, understand human movement quantitatively. And I was always a math and science girl. And then I got suckered into a PhD in biomechanics and movement science, which was an interdisciplinary program. So I took a lot of classes in exercise physiology and other areas, but also in the motor control concept, which ended up being a huge asset for our conversations about plyos and movement variability and the way we approach our current training system. So having a mix of the quantitative side, but also really understanding human movement is complicated for sure, and the control of it is complicated. I think it's a unique mix.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so just the reason why I really wanted to bring up biomechanics, I think early on when we first came on the scene, if you will, we were kind of known as the biomechanics people. And I don't know why, but that never really settled well with me, because I thought, well, that's a subsect of what we do. It's at the heart of probably what we do. But we consider ourselves to be the people that are really about player development. And player development is very broad. It has to do with chasing performance and how to do that. It has to do with understanding patterns and collecting data and monitoring health and wellness. As you know, we could go on the different categories or subcategories of the things that we work with on a daily basis, whether it's with coaches or athletes. But the heart of it is understanding the motion. And that became very clear to us. You can't teach it. You can't influence it. You can't manage it, at least not well, if you don't understand it.
That's right.
So early on in this process for us of collecting data, we really just started with, let's better understand the motion. Tell us why, or tell our listeners really why it was not as simple. Let's rewind to 2018. It was not as simple as, hey, I, Ashley Sunshine, want to understand the pitching motion a little bit better. Let me just open up the following research articles, and that should do it for me. Why was it not that simple? Why is it still not that simple for coaches out there now?
Yeah, I think the sort of lack of softball pitching research, particularly, I say it's picked up a little bit, maybe in the last 10 years or so, but before that it was just this presumption that the motion was more natural, so why study it, right? There really wasn't an understanding of, I think, how difficult it really is. We did not understand the double turn concept, or this understanding of what the trunk and arm have to do together. I was just as guilty of that with my own graduate work, of not seeing it through the lens of the entire body, and it just didn't have the energy of funding and motivation that baseball did, because baseball was experiencing a number of injuries. You had, Tommy John and all of these types of high profile, big time loss injuries that, were driving a lot of the funding from the MLB, and softball just didn't have that.
Yeah.
And, the complexities of studying a motion where the arm does go in a full circle, it presents some things really challenging from an analysis standpoint, that, it takes understanding the motion, and or at least backtracking and realizing you don't understand the motion and coming at it with a clean slate to really start to ask the right questions of what does the motion actually mean? What does it do? What are we asking our pitchers to do? And then going to the analysis part.
Yeah.
And so I get that question a lot of like, why isn't there research? It's like, because that research is pretty hard. I've been doing it for most of my life, and it's a challenge. And, what's out there is great, but we are still suffering many, many years later from a lack of good, solid depth of research on the motion.
I think what became pretty clear to me as someone who, again, let's kind of go back 2018, if you will, was really trying to dive into this world of understanding the motion a little bit better. I started to realize there were a few categories. One was the category of, okay, there's some findings, there's some data and research, but I'm a coach and this doesn't speak to me. There's no practical application. I can't read this and then know what to do when I go out into the cage, the bullpen, et cetera, into the training environment with my athlete. And as we came into the scene, not of like, we want to lead biomechanics, but in like, we want to be able to understand what player development looks like for pitching. So this means coaching. This means influencing what the athlete can do. So there has to be this level of practical application. So that was one thing that I think right away, we always came at it from a standpoint of, we want to understand the motion in order to influence it. That is different than just being able to write an article and then hands off, what you do with it, you do with it, right?
There's always limitations too. I mean, research in a lab, research, quote unquote, in the field or in the bullpen is always inherently different. Not just the tools that are available to you, but there are, you go in with a scientific approach, obviously, to, generating research that would lead to a publication. Those, you have to always keep in mind biases, whether they are inherent or not inherent, your own, influenced by the data, but it's difficult to generalize any kind of research study. So, and this is getting a little bit beyond the topic, but we also don't value in the current, sort of tenure academic concepts of what drives research of replication. And so everybody wants to be novel, everybody wants to be new, because that's what gets you, attention and high profile. And honestly, what we need are replicating studies over and over again in different populations with better methods to make sure that the questions that we're answering with that information can be generalized.
Yeah.
But most of our studies, coming out of the 2000s, essentially, there were, some higher level athletes, college and above. And we only really have just started to get into even understanding the youth motion, and like that development from, starting as a young pitcher and beyond, and whether we should even separate them by those categories necessarily.
Yeah. So I think we came into this in this unique space of, we're not trying to drive publications. We're not trying to become these high profile researchers.
And coming from the academic world.
Right.
It's a breath of fresh air.
Right. And we're like, we just want to be able to influence a pitcher's actual journey.
Ask good questions.
And in order to do that, we have to understand the motion a little bit more. I think it became very clear to me that we were treating the motion as if we were trying to replicate a series of positions, that we were trying to, and this still exists, there is a pitching coach, X is like, this is the style. This is what everyone needs to look like. These are the patterns, or this pitcher looks like this, so everyone should do that. And what we really have learned along the way is it's simply, outlandish, right? The body is so complex that it is not about replicating something. I always say, is there an optimal? Yeah, of course, there's always an optimal. Is optimal realistic for the overwhelming majority? Absolutely not. The level of complexity and the types of variables that are involved as far as the trunk, the arm, the relationship, we're not seeking optimal, right? And so it wasn't about going into the biomechanics space for us, was not about validating that we know how to teach the motion versus the person next to us, which is still the world that I think pitching instructors, some live in. And honestly, at this point, I think there was a time where I felt in that battle, and now to me it's noise, right? And it's like, that's not how the motion works. That's not, that's not relevant. Essentially, what we're really looking at is a better understanding of how the trunk, what's being asked of the trunk, how does that influence the arm, and then ultimately what does that do to ball flight. So if we're going to influence the motion, what that does not mean is simply saying this is what your patterns need to look like. Let's now look at a video let's maybe even look at data and let's make sure it's matching.
Right.
In my mind, there is no such thing as pattern improvement if you do not know how the ball was influenced.
Absolutely.
So we're talking about velocity over time. We're talking about brake concepts, variability concepts, change of speed. We're talking about health and wellness. What biomechanics and the understanding of the motion is really about is not validating that one instructor is right in his or her teachings. It's not about the reason why, pitcher A was the best pitcher of all time is because she does this and now everyone needs to do that. It's about understanding that it is at the heart of health and wellness. So understanding specifically how one pitcher moves and its relationship to her health and wellness, in addition to its relationship to what she does and does not produce on the ball.
100%. I think when you mentioned style to me always means some concept of I'm trying to achieve a particular position, right? Whether it's from a still of a video or some particular, I want them to look like this. That's a style, in my opinion. And it's one, the human body is way too complicated to apply the same thing to everybody. But when you approach this conversation of understanding the biomechanics of the motion first, and within the, sort of within pitcher constraints for herself, you start to see patterns arise. And so the conversation then shifts from what are these positions I need her to achieve versus where does the body get put into optimal and efficient transfers of energy. And those are active, right? They're not still positions. It's not, I need to be, this position with my arm at stride foot contact. It's how did I get there, right? And seeing it through the entire motion. And as you said, it's, inefficient pitching patterns will show up eventually, right? Some pitchers are incredibly lucky and resilient to a certain degree where maybe they never have injury. Maybe their performance is fantastic. They are very effective. Great. It doesn't mean their patterns are wrong. It doesn't mean their patterns are not to be replicated, but it's going to catch up at some point, which is where the workload conversation comes in. And so you've got to know her story. And that's where I feel that biomechanics is most powerful. And I think in general, the biomechanics world, in this kind of research, we've always done, every sport's done this. It's said like, okay, that person is the GOAT, right? And so we're going to replicate everything about that person. And it's only, I think, now we're starting to see the level of individual differences because we're studying them more effectively. And we're saying, okay, it's not just a mold.
Yeah.
It's these really clear transfers of energy that are important. How you achieve that, how you get there is going to look different for everybody.
Yeah. This concept or this phrase we often use here, like know an athlete's story, this is what we're referring to, right? So we started, when we started looking at, okay, let's better understand the motion, majority of this time we have used wearable sensors. So I'll ask you to explain what wearable sensors are, pros and cons. And we've just collected data. Now, by no means have we used wearable sensors and said, okay, this value is what everyone is chasing. One, because even if we were in a motion capture lab from the start, you don't chase a value just for the reasons we're talking about. This isn't about achieving specific. It's much more, you have to take a much more sort of like bird's eye view to what is being accomplished in the motion as a whole and not just individual data points, right? Okay, so not only have we never done that, right? But also we recognize that the values that come out of these wearable sensors are specific to that technology, which is okay because we are not, again, chasing very specific things. We're saying when using this technology,
right,
we are seeing the relationship of this from a trunk standpoint, that it does this to the arm, and therefore this is why it's yielding XYZ on the ball.
Yep.
The consistency in the story and understanding the relationship to each of these. The fact that the type of technology you use will change the specific values that you see, right, is irrelevant because of the way in which we use it. So can you explain that a little bit more clearly maybe to anyone that might be listening of like, well, you can't study biomechanics. You don't know what you're talking about if you're not in a motion capture lab.
Yeah, there's always a trade-off, always a trade-off. There's trade-offs with gold standard motion capture, right? So anytime we say something is gold standard, it just means it gives us the clearest opportunity, whether it's something like X-ray or MRI, there's always trade-offs. There's always risks and trade-offs to that stuff. So you're talking about a piece of technology that has the most reward for its application with the least amount of risk, essentially. And motion capture is very high reward. It, is able to, again, has limitations, but it's able to really identify, body position in space very well. It's our top level right now. And anything that is basically quote unquote below that also has trade-offs. And I think, as you said, it's not about taking this sensor data and saying, okay, it's comparable to this. It's telling that story within the data set. And as you were talking, I kept thinking, the telling of the athlete's story is sort of internal to those sensors, yes, but really where that came from was pattern recognition. Right? It was those value ranges and you seeing, with the data and your eye, because we need that.
Mm-hmm.
There are limitations, as we said, which I'll talk about, of seeing, okay, when a pitcher is within this range or outside this range, here's the consequence. She may make up for that somewhere else in the motion, but this is the consequence of that. That's just pattern recognition,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it just happens to be that these sensors are the way we're able to see that because that's the technology we've chosen.
Yeah.
So, anytime you have any sort of wearable sensor, you're dealing with an accelerometer, the same type of technology that makes your phone go from portrait to landscape. And accelerometers have their value. They've been around a really long time. But just like any other technology, their trade-offs are, one, the positives is that you can put them right on in the bullpen, right? Mm-hmm. So their field use is fantastic. Battery life, they're non-invasive, they're not overwhelming for the athlete to put on, but their drawbacks are oftentimes they can't capture fast enough, mm-hmm. right? So that was a limitation of a particular generation of sensors we were using. We couldn't use them for pitching because they didn't capture fast enough, mm-hmm. and the ball delivery was just too quick, right? So you just have to know what your limitations are, what are you looking for in the motion or whatever you're studying, and then what is the limitation of that technology?
Yeah.
And anytime that you've got the trunk and the arm trying to make a connection with each other, the speed at which the arm is collected is very important, mm-hmm. right? And so, as I said, ball delivery it's really quick. And I think even the current generation of things that we're using, there's still limitations.
Sure.
We have way farther to go in understanding the trunk-arm relationship now that we're partnering with biomechanics labs and being able to see, the depth of that data.
Yeah, and we'll get into that as far as now that we're in the motion capture lab and getting that data and being able to look at it, applying even greater beyond what we're typically using here, obviously, not just the wearables, but now force plates and such. We'll get into that.
Yep.
But I think this is where the point I really want to drive home is that we have always used this idea of let's study biomechanics as a means to let's try to push player development as much as possible. When an athlete comes to us in pain, why is she in pain? And what we've started to realize, there's this element of there's all of these variables that are involved. There is the amount of power she has in the system, which is not usually linked to her pattern efficiency. So there's a level of efficiency. So her trunk contributes very little. She has a lot of an innate power profile that's elite, which makes her great, but it puts her at increased risk for pain. She has a particular pitch profile where she holds her forearm in a certain position. She gets into a certain position in her posture that puts her at increased risk. All of these puzzle pieces are so individualized, so unique to that athlete. But now that we've gone in, we're trying to really understand player development, influence pitcher health and pitcher performance. The heart of both of those, the ability to influence those really comes in understanding the motion, understanding, okay, when we see these patterns, her options now, if she gets into this position, her options are this, or this, right? We now know these things. Okay, wow, that athlete had a compensation to get out of that. I've never seen that compensation before, right? There are these types of things. And so, yes, of course, that when we're using our wearable sensors, of course, if we were going at it of the arm must achieve get at ball delivery, has to achieve the following value, or we have to see the following range. if that's the way we were going into this, this is not a great approach, right? We would not be essentially designing the best research setting. But that isn't what we have gone into this. We've tried to understand what patterns look like, what different options are once patterns start to break down, how it influences the arm, and then ultimately what that does to the ball. We now know, because of years of that work through wearable sensors, that certain pitchers, there are certain pitch types or spin directions, break profiles, however you want to think about it, that are not in the cards for them. There's gone are the days of saying every pitcher has to throw X, Y, and Z. We now know that the underhand motion only allows for access to certain positions on the ball. So even the slightest bit of compromise in trunk positioning and posture limits that even more, right? It's not an overhand slot. It is not, okay, all these options to get inside the ball, behind the ball, and the outside of the ball. We don't have that from the underhand slot. So as the trunk then starts to break down a little bit, it typically limits more and more. Do athletes have different strategies or compensations? Are there some pitchers who can spin the ball in multiple directions? Yes, of course. And now we can understand why. What do they do in order to achieve that? Sometimes an athlete's her very compensations that make her ball flight great, and we've done multiple episodes on this, also put her at increased risk of pain. And so depending on her level of, how elite she is, we may not want to go after that. So understanding how her patterns connect to that are important. And then how she trains, what workload looks like for her has to be specific to that connection. So the wearable sensors have really been a great opportunity for us to understand the connection. It's about biomechanics and its role in player development as a whole. Yeah. That's really what I want to come across here to the audience, as far as this isn't about this is how, if you walked into OGX and watched every one of our pitchers, you would not say, oh, clearly they're all throwing like X, they all look like Y. It's because they trained with OGX. That's ridiculous. That's not how we see human movement. And our research thus far has showed us that this is not how the pitching motion is designed to be taught.
Yeah, and I think sometimes the lack of research, when it does come out and is available, there are coaches that attach very strongly to it, and rightly so. It's that level of, research is important. There's a standard to it. It's peer review. Those things, should give us the confidence that we can take the information from it and apply it. But the reality is that, as you said, kind of to start this whole conversation, is it's not always coach applicable, mm-hmm. right? And even, statistics is not my strong suit, but even understanding the statistics and the way correlation, what that means, right? What it means to have means and standard deviations, and to have relationships and correlations and p-values. Like you can have a value that says it is statistically significant. We run across this all the time in clinical research, that value means, yes, between these two groups, maybe high school and college, there was a difference. And that's all it means, is that there was a difference. It doesn't talk about the size of that difference. It doesn't talk about, that value doesn't mean that difference had some sort of performance effect. It's just, it's different. And so it can be tricky to take that level of research and maybe not have the nuances of the statistics side down, and know, okay, I like this value speaks to me, I'm looking for this, I want to understand this. But to translate that into an athlete, it's tricky. Yeah, that's really tricky. And again, we don't ever try to go for, you've got to hit this range, we just keep measuring and watching the patterns unfold.
Right. So I think first and foremost, being able to explain what it really means to us to be in the biomechanics world, and why when someone says, oh, they're the biomechanics people, I have sort of thought well, no, we're not. We don't just go after patterns for the sake of patterns. We go after understanding patterns for the sake of influencing what matters. So with that said, anyone who is still in the world of pitching instruction, pitching lessons, where everything is just about mechanics and pitching patterns, without there being some objective way, some way to visualize, are getting into those patterns. People say my mechanics have gotten better. And I always say how do you know? Well, because when we opened the video, but what influence did that have on anything? Are you out of pain now? And they're like, well, I wasn't in pain. Okay. Is your velo better? Well, I don't know. We don't really look at velo. Is your brake better? Well, we don't measure brake. We might be measuring command, right? But so there, in my mind, there is no such thing as improving patterns. There's a such thing as changing patterns. You can say that you've changed your patterns by just looking at video, right? And saying, okay, you look different. Improving, which is
a whole different ballgame.
Is a whole different way. That is making the assumption that it is better for you. And the only way to know if that pattern change was better is if you have some way of showing that it did something, had a positive effect on health, wellness, arm pain, back pain, et cetera, velo, brake, et cetera, right? And so the same exact pattern change that I might go after on athlete A might be catastrophic for athlete B. And that's just the reality of it, right? And we now know that. So that is sort of, I think, in a nutshell, like what it means to understand biomechanics. But now we've also gotten to this chapter for us where we know that the wearable sensors can tell us a lot about the connectivity of an athlete's story. It allows us to tell an athlete and her coaches and parents, et cetera, what her story is and help her better understand that story. But we're pushing beyond that now, right? Now, the types of patterns we are seeing, we need to go one step deeper. Yeah. So can you tell us, and I think we will have future episodes where we go into more detail about our relationship with UNO and what that looks like from a standpoint of what it even looks like to help design the lab. Yeah. I think that in itself is probably another episode. But can you tell our listeners a little bit about generally what that relationship is, how it is really kind of like the next step for us in understanding another level, a more complex level of data, specifically when it comes to biomechanics?
Yeah. So this relationship with, the University of Nebraska at Omaha, they had already had basically a pitching lab set up for baseball, and we're getting a lot of inquiries on softball, and reached out, to us, essentially, to me, essentially, as, we're getting these inquiries. We don't really know how to handle what's different, unique about it. And would you help us? And so it became a very strong relationship from the start. I mean, the level of biomechanics research that, just the university itself is known for, the Center for Human Movement Variability, it is known for all of that. It made it an obvious partner, right, in terms of quality. It has been it's been so rewarding to, one, as you said, we've reached our max with where we are from a wearable sensor standpoint. Mm-hmm. The questions I get a lot are like, okay, well, what about markerless kinematics, right? So you mentioned video, you mentioned watching video. And I will say with a lot of confidence, we are not there yet in softball pitching. We're not. It's too complicated. And I'll be very clear of markerless kinematics, any app that is selling you that the values that come out of that app are accurate, you should take with a huge grain of salt. Markerless kinematics need to be fed motion capture data that's marker based. And in order to validate it, right? It's just like, again, we have this gold standard, which has been motion capture, which has limitations, skin movement, markers falling off, you're in a lab, there's all kinds of limitations, but it's our gold standard. So in order for any app or anything to tell you that values from even 3-dimensional video, but 2-dimensional video are right, has to be fed good marker-based data. So tread cautiously with that technology right now. But this work of kind of knowing that, okay, we've reached our max with our sensors, and having this hand in this collaboration of, okay, we really have been able to support the conversation of how to design that lab, that, within their, capabilities to ask the right questions, to really capture a full, complete data set with force plates and motion capture. And we have been doing markerless, and I'll tell you, there's limitations to that as well in terms of accuracy, as I said. So we've captured that data. And so we have felt, in this collaboration, that marker-based is the way to go, because there isn't enough good quality data sets out there to feed that stuff. And so having that hand in that and knowing okay, we have a path toward moving beyond our sensors, and the level of new questions that we get to ask, it's so nerdy, but the questions that we get to ask now that we have this better set of tools at our disposal, I mean, it opens the door on so many things.
Yeah, for us, it's this concept of we've spent years understanding patterns and their connection to health and ball flight data, right? And so now we even created a report that's when you're in this range, when the data is in this range, it means this. It means this for your patterns. It means this. This is what it's likely to do to your arm. Does it match your ball flight? Yes, right? That's our process. Now we've been able to take that same concept, apply it to data that is now from a motion capture standpoint. So obviously it's a higher level data set, and be able to see, of course, the actual ranges. So for example, what the wearable sensors might say is 3,000 might come out as 8,000, right? So the ranges might shift. And so now understanding what those ranges look like with a different data set because of a different level of technology, but still that the connectivity, even though the ranges may shift because the technology has shifted, the connectivity to the story is the same, right?
Storytelling gets better. It just gets better.
Right.
It gets more clear.
Yeah.
We can start to see some of these nuances with the arm, especially. The arm is really, kind of plagued us with the sensors, as I said, because of their capture rate, and the storytelling gets better. It just gets better. And I say the other big limitation that we've had to work around is we don't have any feet, right? The force plates and event detection. That's been so much of our conversation with this group has been, when I say event detection, I mean, what are these really clear points in the motion that we want to make sure we understand? Where is the arm in space?
Right.
What is the max this? That's event detection. And we already know that there's going to be lots of challenges to any sort of singular algorithm because pitchers they do things so differently.
Yeah.
But understanding even what we're trying to go for in terms of these points in the motion that we care about, and just seeing what does the data bring us on that. That's been really challenging. But having these, having the feet, having the force plates, it's a big deal. But at the end of the day, the feet don't deliver the ball. And so understanding all of that, force plates and all, we still have to have
the context of the ball.
Yeah, the context of the ball. So not only are we chasing motion capture and force plates, but having ball flight in the lab at the same time, captured simultaneously. It's basically a replication of our assessment process with really good biomechanics data. I mean, quality.
Exactly. So this partnership for us, let me back up. I was thinking when we were talking about where we really recommended to put the force plates, we wouldn't have known that 5 years ago.
No.
But basically this work that we've been doing in the underground has allowed us to understand what we are seeing. That direction of launch is a huge issue that we need to account for when the weight shift. Some athletes put more weight on this foot versus this foot. You've got to account for both, right? So even our ability to have conversation with UNOs, they're the individuals who are helping to design the lab of where those force plates would go. We couldn't have done that a couple of years ago, right? So we've come in now with such better information because of this work we've been doing in the underground. But this collaboration and this partnership is our ability to ask questions and start to get answers beyond what a lesser or a lower level of technology can provide. So it's us elevating research for the game, which is huge. It's our opportunity then to, when you're talking about markerless, when you're talking about wearables, to push those, to really provide some validation for any expansion in technology in our game has got to come from a solid gold standard database, which we're obviously looking to grow. It's really exciting work, obviously.
Yeah,
this idea of if pitching is ever going to have a workload management culture, I mean, a real one, whether it's pitch counts, whether it's, it's going to come from the type of work that we're doing. Now, the ability to show how much stress is actually on the body because of the motion, right? And to disconnect it from, because it doesn't look like baseball, then it gets a certain reputation. We are really giving the motion the time, attention, and research it deserves. And again, we're able to come into this now with such a different lens than we could have years ago because of the way we've really taken in the data from the wearable sensors.
It was a starting point. And
absolutely.
It served us very well.
And they'll continue to serve us because they're what's applicable to the fields, right? And so I think I wanted to be able to use this as an opportunity to explain, like when we talk about biomechanics, that can seem very overwhelming But at the end of the day, remember, biomechanics is a piece of player development. We do not believe in looking at patterns as if it's a silo on an island. It has to connect to what matters, which is this health and performance concept, right? And so we are continuing to pour ourselves to dive into knowing more and more about pitching patterns, and continuing to really challenge different tech companies to be able to give more access to other coaches and athletes who cannot be in a gold standard motion capture lab, right? This is not, we're trying to make sure that the information is applicable, because that's how it's always started for us.
Right. The field applications and any technology that comes, to the I don't say coaches level, I mean to their literally where they're coaching.
Yeah.
Needs to be informed by this higher level technology. And so field technology will always have its application. Every sport has that, right? Down to a stopwatch, to a laser timer, right? Every sport has a level of field technology that has to be readily available for the athlete in their environment.
Yeah.
But it's got to be informed with good stuff. And
yeah.
So that's the stuff I'm so excited to continue to partner with them and to build this and to, start to build these data sets of, one, for researchers to ask questions, right? For researchers to ask questions to guide health and wellness, to guide performance, but to really give this motion what it deserves.
Yeah, same here.
Understanding.
Okay, so we didn't know, when I was like, let's talk about biomechanics in this episode. This could be 12 episodes in one, but I think we should stop at that point. Yeah. I think the topic in and of itself is a lot and can be overwhelming. If you're an athlete, if you're a parent, if you're even a coach listening to this, I think the biggest takeaway that I can really ask you to really have from this episode is to understand the role of biomechanics. If you feel as if I don't have time for patterns, I don't have time to influence them, or I spend all of my time just looking at video without ever measuring what's happening on the ball, maybe check yourself in understanding that we really can't segment one from the other.
Yeah,
right?
I always say, every coach is a biomechanist in some way. It's just a matter of the tools that you're using.
Yeah.
Right. And so, my kind of running joke is like finger painting on iPhone video, right? There is a value to that. I joke about it, but there's a value to that of that's what I have access to. And so I consult with coaches a lot that are like, this is all I have. Great. Let's make the best use of it. But your ability to ultimately answer whether or not you are truly improving something comes in the effect, right? Understanding the cause, but the effect, health and wellness, performance, and making your tools sharper, which means moving beyond, video and maybe even investment in other technologies. But again, those technologies need to be fed with better information.
We might sit on a consulting call and look at video.
Sure.
And yes, we're going to be asking for some type of what was the individual response, what objective data did we get based off of those recommendations, but we made those recommendations off of a reference point.
Totally.
What we are trying to do now is to keep growing and pushing the reference point, right? That does not mean that that's the only way to know if patterns are good or bad, but we've got to grow this central reference point as a whole to keep the motion, to keep all coaching kind of driving in the right direction, and to keep athletes and their families from getting stuck in this he said, she said, so I have to do everything. There should be a much more objective way to know if something is working. I mean, that's the reality. It happens all the time here. Like, I could think that was the best approach for athlete A, but all the data that's coming back is saying it's not working. So there should no longer be this, well, they said I have to hang in there for 3 months because my mechanics are changing, and none of this is a whole nother episode probably, but are the types of things that we're seeing, right? So getting out of the weeds of following style, getting out of the weeds of like that I have to make my motion look like something. We have a better reference point of, again, not only knowing a really, more elite level about the motion, knowing about the complexity of the motion, and most importantly, its connectivity to things beyond mechanics. Yeah. So let's keep this conversation going. I'd say we'll cut it off at today's episode. I'd like to go into a little bit more of some of the specifics we've collected so far with UNO. Mm-hmm. We might even kind of go into some of the visualizations we have thus far to show what that data is telling us. It's exciting. It's definitely a huge part in order to grow the game, grow the position. And so we probably can have about 3 or 4 episodes. So
100%.
Laura, booking you for the next couple of weeks, so put it on your calendar. Okay, well, everyone, thank you for tuning in today. I think this is a really exciting and important topic when it comes to, as we said, giving the position the attention, the resources it absolutely deserves. We feel really honored and privileged to be in that ring.
Yeah.
And we're going to keep advocating for it because we know that our athletes deserve it. So thanks for joining us today. As always, everyone, look out for some future episodes talking about biomechanics, the specific work that we're doing in the UNO lab. Lots to come and a lot of really, I think just great concepts, great data that we're just going to continue to share here on this podcast.
Stay tuned.
All right, everyone. Between now and next episode, remember, keep questing on to redefine the circle. Thanks, everyone.